Who were these Rishis that wrote down the Vedas, that wrote down this ancient knowledge? While they were written down in 1500 BC, the Vedas themselves say that this knowledge, this information is much older and comes from a direct source. It's always been known, as how they put it. It is the infinite ancient wisdom that permeates the cosmos, that permeates the all. Now here we are, 2023, where we are in the earlier phase of this electrical Dwapara Era, which is going to lead us into a greater era, the mental age, the Treta Yuga, by 4000, and then we would ascend up into the Satya Yuga that would start in about 7698. In this video, I'm going to discuss the ancient Indian Yuga Cycle and how it predicts human evolution. The reason that this is an intriguing avenue to explore and research is because we are often caught up in the minute and micro details of all of the questions and inquiries that we have about the human experience, reality, consciousness, history, whatever it might be. And we can pursue these questions and go down deep avenues of research, coming to understandings, coming close as we can to truth and wisdom. And there's so much, and there's so many years, thousands of years. And while we can focus on any question or any point of all of this information and all of these ideas, concepts, we also can zoom out, take a bigger picture look at the macrocosm. And one of the unique avenues that offers such a conception that comes from the ancient literature are the Yuga cycles, which come out of ancient India. So we're going to be looking at them in trying to get a different perspective and seeing these larger timescales, this larger process, seeing where we may fit into that. And the yugas are of special interest because when we look at them closer and we look at the events and the narratives and the trajectory of human history as we know it from the records that we have been able to find and then put together information, data to come up with a framework of what our history is, it becomes very interesting to look at this. So before we dive into the dates, the cycles, the yugas, and how they work and how they have correlated with events in our history and where we are now, it's worth looking at the source of this concept of the Yuga cycles. Where does it come from? Okay, so first let's zoom out, taking a look at the world map here. And where we're talking about ancient India and the Yuga cycles, we're talking about this part of the earth here in the Indus Valley civilizations. Here's a map of the different world civilizations that we know about and have uncovered enough archaeological evidence to put together a conception of these civilizations. We have the Egyptians over in the west here in green, Mesopotamia and the Sumerians in the Middle East region here. Then further east we have the Indus Valley civilization, and then over here in the northeast, China. And all of these civilizations existed roughly about 3000 BC, about 5,000 years ago. And the oldest of these that the consensus is in Mesopotamia here with the Sumerians, as the artifacts and the writings date back the furthest in time. But all of these civilizations were certainly there at 3000 BC, and that's where we get the Indus Valley civilization. And the Harappa and the Mohenjo-Daro are the two groups that historians generally group them into. And they are around from roughly 3000 BCE to 1900 BCE. And here is another look at this civilization. Here goes down to the Arabian Sea. and the rivers flowing out of the Himalayan mountain, the great mountain range, and coming down to the Indus Valley. And this is where these groups of people are. We know about them because of the artifacts that were left behind that date to roughly this time period. Now, not much else is known about these people because they did not have written records that they kept that we've found. So all historians can really puzzle and piece together is what kind of maybe culture they had, that they had an organization of civilization of some kind, and we don't see much until later periods in history. A group of texts called the Vedas were first written down between 1500 and 500 BC. Veda means knowledge, and these were the ancient Indian writings that were believed to be written or said to be written by the sages, the Rishis of ancient India. Now, who were these Rishis that wrote down the Vedas, that wrote down this ancient knowledge? Now, it's important to note that while they were written down in 1500 BC, the Vedas themselves say that this knowledge, this information is much older and comes from a direct source. It's always been known, is how they put it. It is the infinite ancient wisdom that permeates the cosmos, that permeates the all. And this was transmitted through the Rishis and first written down as we know about it in 1500 BC. So the Rishis were enlightened. They were sages, priests, if you will, who spent their lives meditating and pursuing spiritual wisdom and knowledge. And India has a deep history of this that continues to this day. So they are the ones who transmitted this information, known as the Seers of thought. And this meant that they were perceiving this information directly from the source of all, what the Vedas refer to as Brahma, this one source and substance that permeates all of creation. Now, what's interesting is that the Rishis regularly refer in the Vedas to something called Soma, which was a drink that was derived from some mysterious plants. And they would drink this Soma and they would credit it with giving them visions and giving them aid in communicating with divine sources of wisdom and knowledge. So some scholars have speculated about what Soma was, and some believing it's one substance or another, in some cases even believing that it may have been a mushroom. But what we do know for sure is that the Rishis, as is told in the Vedas, they did take this substance to give them these visions, which then they transmitted this information. So with what we know about meditation, and scientifically now, today in 2023, how certain sages and yogis, meditation masters who've been practicing these meditation techniques for many years, we do know that different abnormal brain waves have been measured. And we also know through the literature of research into entheogenic plants, psychedelic therapies, that substances such as ayahuasca and the active ingredient DMT, as well as psilocybin, will report in ordinary people a heightened sense of spirituality, and many report communicating directly with divine sources, having understandings of reality and of a spiritual sense that go beyond words, that can be directly perceived and understood in those moments of visionary lucidity. So we can see how here are the Rishis of thousands of years ago meditating, taking Soma, and we can speculate that they may have really been tapping into some kind of cosmic knowledge, some kind of information that permeates all, that we all can access in one way or another to understand what our reality is and what our place in the cosmos is. So that's the Rishis. That's who wrote the Vedas, where ultimately this information of the Yuga cycles is connected to. Now, the Yuga cycles does not come directly from the Vedas, but it comes from a slightly later text, the Puranas. Now, the Puranas were written down in 400 BC, between roughly 400 BCE and 1000 CE, so a little bit after the Vedas, but they were compiled by somebody who is known as Vyasa, who was a great sage, and it is believed that it is Vyasa who organized and compiled the Vedas and also composed the Puranas, which the source of the information in the Puranas was also believed to be from direct experience of Brahma, of the All, of spiritual insights gained through meditation, spiritual practices, as well as even communication with the gods. Now, this is a speculation, and this is just thinking of ideas outside the box. We do know that there are many researchers who believe that there's evidence that the gods of the ancient world, and as they're referred to and as they're remembered and written down in those texts, may have actually been beings of a higher advanced consciousness who may have been spirit beings, form of other dimensions, may have actually been physical beings coming down to earth and interacting with humanity. Certainly where we are now in 2023, we are seemingly in the middle of a process of potential disclosures from the United States government about knowledge of non-human intelligence. And if we do get to that point of coming to a understanding and facts or evidence that there are beings that are not human, that are of high level of advancement and intelligence beyond our own as we currently know it, and that these beings may actually go back thousands of years in their interaction with humans and the earth, we may have a totally different light on these ancient scriptures and texts from 4, 5, 6,000 years ago, who spoke of these gods, as in the Sumerians, who said that these gods literally came down to earth and taught them all of these sciences and all of these practices and technological advancements. They credit them to the gods. So we see somewhat of a correlation here with the ancient Indian civilizations and through the Puranas, which really the Vedas do not so much refer to the gods. They are more cosmological in nature and referring to Brahma, the one source of all, whereas the Puranas start to make more reference to specific gods and deities. And the Puranas are referred to as that which is remembered, whereas the Vedas are that which is heard. So this is sort of passing on knowledge that is believed to have been passed down through the generations. And so this is where we're getting the concept of the Yuga cycles here in the Puranas. So what is the Yuga cycle? It is a 24,000 year cycle that essentially descends into a lower state of consciousness, a lower state of spiritual evolution of humanity before hitting a low point and then starting to ascend back up into this golden age of spiritual enlightenment. And this is believed to be in correlation with the greater cycles of forces of our solar system, of our universe, and the human consciousness in relation to all of that. Now, we have to understand we know so little about what our reality is and what the cosmos is, so we can at least imagine that there is this greater order to it where our consciousness does play a role and does have this sort of cyclical nature to it, as many things in nature that we can observe do. What's interesting is as we start to look at this and look at some of the dates and what we know about our own known history from what we've been able to piece together, there are some compelling correlations to believe that this Yuga cycle may have really been generally pretty accurate in how human consciousness evolves through thousands of years. If we look at this starting point here, 11,500 BC, we see that this correlates with the younger Dryas, where there is building evidence of a major cataclysm that took place and likely caused destruction in large parts of the world of that time and human occupation, human civilization of that time. So it's interesting that this is the kind of starting point of this downward cycle, and it correlates with that cataclysm and, of course, the flooding that may have resulted from this, and how all of these myths and legends that we see coming in the text in this later period here, roughly 4,000 years ago, we see all of these texts throughout the world referring to a time where there was a great flood and marking their histories as a time from before the flood and after the flood. And we see in texts such as the Atrahasis of the Sumerians, they speak of this peaceful time before the flood when lions did not kill and so forth, when there was this kind of golden age. So it's interesting. It's interesting how that correlates to this time before the flood, which would have been this whole Satya Yuga period beforehand. And then the flood happens, and we kind of see that there's this decline happening now. So the next stage, the Treta Yuga, 6,700 BC to 3,100 BC. This would have still been a period of conscious evolution greater than where we are now, but it would have been declining. And what's interesting about this is this period in history, 6,700 to 3,000 BC, in terms of known civilizations and artifacts and writings about people of this time, we have very little. And why that is, there can be a number of reasons, but we have very little, so we don't have much to go off of if they were more advanced or not. We only have the stories that come later, towards the end of this period, roughly 4,000 BC, the first written works and the first evidence of advanced civilizations that comes to us in the Sumerians, in the Old Kingdom of Egypt. And we start to hear their stories of the previous ages, of gods and demigods, of a time when the gods walked on the earth with humans, when the gods ruled over humans. We see that in Sumer, and we see that in Egypt as well. They speak of this time. Now, whether that's symbolic to mean that was a time when humans were more advanced, their consciousness was more advanced, or whether that means there were literally beings more advanced that were known as the gods that literally were on earth in one form or another, taking part in human civilizations to some extent, we don't know, and we may find out in years to come. Nevertheless, that's what they speak of, is this sort of transition age. That's what all the texts and the myths paint this narrative of, the gods gradually kind of pulling back and humanity going from this greater stage into a less advanced stage. And we even have archaeological evidence to support that. Okay? We go from roughly 3000 BC up into 1700 CE. This is the real critical period here, because there are various archaeological studies. For example, looking at the city of Eridu in Sumer, one of the oldest cities there, as they dug deeper down, they found sign of a more advanced structures, more advanced artifacts. And as they got higher up, more recent in time, they found there was a regression. And this is found in Egypt as well. Pottery and artifacts of a much higher precision and advancement later back in time, going back to this period and beyond it, right here in the green here, the Treta Yuga, this, which is all we have evidence of, whether time just made, that's as far back as we can go and what we've been able to dig up. But we do see these signs of a greater advancement. So that correlates again here with the Yuga cycle. And it's interesting to take that into consideration. Now, as we move along here, we go into this orange phase here, the Dwapara, also the electrical age, which would have been essentially the same type of phase that we are in now. And this would have been a gradual decline of these technologies. And some speculate about the pyramids and what the pyramids were. We don't know exactly how old they are. Some Egyptian texts suggest that they were there from an older time. And maybe they were built during this Treta or Satya Yuga age, and maybe they were some type of power structures or energy structures that we don't even understand how they work now. We're starting to see maybe that some of those great mysteries are coming. Maybe in our lifetime and in the coming generations, some of this will come to light. But it would all line up with this general progression. So now, this is where we know a lot about. Okay, but from about 3000 BC to 1700 CE, we know a lot about it. This is the history that we know about. Now, of course, a lot of it is obfuscated, hidden, even directly and intentionally, but what we are able to get a pretty good idea of human activity on planet Earth from this time. And what happens, right? What happens in this phase? It lines up pretty accurately with what the Yuga cycle describes. From about 3000 BC up into the year 0, we see empire after empire going out, conquering land, subjugating people, barbarism, the slaughtering of populations to control and dominate them, to have these kingdoms and empires of this is our empire and we're great and powerful. If we can conjecture a bit here, we can reasonably presume that in a more evolved spiritual state, such as the Satya or Treta age, there wouldn't be such conquering and subjugating of people and forcing one's control and power over other groups of people for the sake of doing it and building an empire. This does seem to be a lower state of consciousness, a lower vibratory state of motivation of how to carry oneself as a human being and as a civilization. And the evidence for all that comes now. Perhaps we don't have as much evidence of these material empires and such because perhaps in these older days it was just a totally different way that we can't even imagine. Perhaps material substances were not as important or even just not existent in the way we know it. But coming back here to this time period, what do we see happen? Empires collapsing and falling. We see and then we literally get right at the time of the dark ages, as they're called in the Yugas, the Kali Yuga. This is literally lines up with the dark ages of Europe as we know them. And, if we go back to the Greeks and Plato and Aristotle and in the Arab world and these scientific philosophical understandings which would inspire many and still to this day are the bedrock of our philosophy and science and where it's at now, we see those fade into obscurity as more and more empires come wipe out the knowledge that was preserved for thousands of years, literally forcing places of the world into a dark age. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, conquerors would come and wipe out the priests, and going throughout Europe and wiping out the pagan religions that had existed for many, many years and went back to the oldest times of memory. Their artifacts, their writings destroyed. This all happens at this time period here. 300 AD, 300 CE, roughly, Constantine makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that's when we have the Roman Empire going out and conquering, destroying what they felt was heresy, which broke off from the official Christian teachings that they codified and made as the Christianity of the empire. And anything that deviated from that in a way they did not like, they took out in one way or another. That's just Christianity. The other major world religions have a similar process here of creating the other, creating this division, creating killing in the name of a god, and all of this is all happening during this dark age, right? And this is what we inherited in our recent history. This is really the history that's closest to our memory, coming up into where we seemingly kind of start to come out of this. And it is interesting how it's right at about 1698 here, Common Era, 1700, right when we start to enter what would be this new age, finally out of the dark ages. I mean, go do your history. Look between 700 BC and 1700 AD. It's a brutal time of history. You've got all kinds of things happening. I mean, you've literally got Giovanni Bruno, to think of one example off the top of my head, going around saying, hey, saying things that we would think would be a higher spiritual evolution, saying, hey, it's all one God. All the religions are talking about the same thing. We're all one, preaching things like peace and love. And because he did that, the Roman Empire burning him alive. So this is what we're talking about here. We finally break out of it, and this correlates here, 1700, with what we call the Renaissance. And this was all of those ideas, texts that had been preserved, actually had been kept alive largely in the Arab world, and then the Crusades of Europe going and unearthing some of these older texts, learning about the ancient Greeks that they had no idea about, learning about the ancient civilizations around the world and the knowledge that was preserved there, things like the mysterious Hermetica, which essentially was reported to be the teachings of the ancient Egyptian god Zehudi or Thoth, and who the Greeks would call Hermes, Trismegistus. And all of this comes back and speaks of an older age and speaks of these greater ideals, this higher consciousness. That, along with other developments in art, science, just thinking about our place in the world, that's what the Renaissance is, 1700. So we come out of this, and then we kind of break out of this dark age. And then things begin to, in a relative time scale of this whole 24,000 year cycle, we see from about 1700 in the Renaissance up until now, 2023, a period of 300-400 years, we see how we have gone from this literal dark age into where we are now with our technology. And this period is described as a period where humans begin to understand the finer nature of the electric nature of the universe and of how things work and begin to advance technologically. This has been our path ever since the Renaissance, where we started to question things again. We started to bring back the ancient teachings and what they were saying, and then we started to build on them. This is where modern science came from, and a rebirth of philosophy. So now here we are, 2023, where we are in the earlier phase of this electrical Dwapara Era, which is going to lead us into a greater era, the mental age, the Treta Yuga, by 4,000. And then we would ascend up into the Satya Yuga that would start in about 7,698. So what does this tell us? What does this tell us about where we are now? Right? If we look at from 1700 to now, and then what could happen in the next 2,000 years. I mean, thinking about that is just crazy, because look at where we've gotten in the last 100 years. What happens during this time period? Revolutions and industrialization. Industrialization taking place in the 1800s, right? Totally changes the world, totally changes everything that we've been able to tell about our past and the thousands of years before it. Human relationship with the planet is completely changes. Cities, technology, industrialization, the technological advancement skyrockets exponentially. We go from having no electricity to having what we have now in such a short period of time. This all correlates with this ascending movement here. And now, where do we go from here? Now we see here in 2023, other things are starting to come to light. What's the frontiers, right? What are the frontiers of human potential? We see some of the psychic research coming to light. We see disclosure among us now. Disclosure of information that may have been being kept secret from us for a long time. Knowledge of other beings, of other technology, not of human origin, of great advancement that could potentially completely blow open our understanding of our reality, and perhaps why they have been kept secret for such a long time. So we see we're now flirting with that disclosure and finding that it's not just about crafts and UAP and UFOs and reports of non-human intelligence. It may just be much more than we can even conceive of, and it may be this discovery of what our human potential is, what our place in the universe is, greater technological advancement, so we could see that passing through here and going through a couple thousand years of a process of this new world. Now, what becomes interesting is this last phase, and which would go from 2,000 years from now, 4,000 CE, up to 12,000 in the Common Era. And to think about where we are now with our technology, and to think about that, hey, let's be generous. I hope it's in my lifetime, but let's say in the next 200 years, we get to know more about the UAP phenomenon, the non-human intelligence phenomenon, which clearly there's something there. And I hope that in my lifetime, I hope honestly in the next 10 years, we're going to be learning a lot more. But imagine that gets disclosed publicly, these technologies, this way mind-blowing deeper understanding of reality and what consciousness is. And we play with that or progress that for about 2,000 years from now. And then we enter this age, which still there would be about 4,000 years of that before going into an even higher age. It's like it's hard to imagine what we're even dealing with here, like, are there even human bodies during this? What does it even look like if we're that far advanced from where we are now and we're ascending upwards? Are we talking extra dimensional realities and a human baseline where we're operating in different dimensions, a spiritual enlightenment that we can't even comprehend, or really I couldn't even express or speculate on right now with these words and concepts that I'm using. But this is the idea, is that we are on this upswing, and all of these things kind of line up, and hopefully looking at this here, we could see how the different trajectory and arc of human history as we know it and the developments, they really do line up pretty directly with the Yuga cycles here. So, in conclusion, I think that this is useful for us to incorporate into our contemplation of what reality is, what our place is as humans, and it does also give us a positive sentiment in that we made it through these rough times. Our history's ugly. It's just full of brutality. So in a positive sense, we're coming out of this, and things are happening where we can imagine this evolved, positive future of peace, of love, of a greater understanding of our place in the universe, and not just being literally in the dark saying, hey, we have no idea what any of this is, really. We don't really know where we come from. Yeah, maybe we come from an explosion that happened, and we come from these little cells that came out of the ocean, and we don't even know. That's just a theory that enough people buy into. We get to understand more about what this really is, so we could see that lifting us up into this greater era here. So in wrapping it up here, I think what we can take away is incorporating that into our current understanding, and also just taking into consideration of the mysteries of ancient sources of knowledge. What did the ancients know, and what did they derive as an understanding? If you read the Vedas, they're really profound, as well as a lot of other scriptures from around the world. They're profound, and for a time of 4,000 years ago, it's pretty astonishing that they have such philosophical concepts that we can still utilize and that we can still find to explain our consciousness and our place in this world today. The correlations with known human history, which we discussed, and the positive cosmology in what this could mean, and how we are on that upswing, and perhaps we will see great changes in our lifetime, and if not, the future generations will inherit those, continue to build as we go up towards these ages of enlightenment, and just to accept that, like all things, there is a cycle, there is light and darkness, and there is a continuity, and to understand that though we can't fully comprehend it, perhaps this really is something that the ancient Rishis, the sages of India, had comprehended this as being one of the manifestations of energy, consciousness, and reality that we go through. And certainly as we look at it, and we could study it much deeper and make a whole list of examples, hopefully we see today here in our discussion of it, of how it really does line up with the trajectory of human history and a lot of the key events. So please take this with you. Please look deeper into it. Read more about it. I hope that this will inspire you in your conceptualization of reality for yourself and truth for yourself, and can aid you also when we zoom out and try to look at things from a bigger perspective and accepting the world the way that it is and the darkness of our history. Perhaps this can give us hope for a brighter future.